Hey folks, Ronan here again. Welcome back to Performance Process. Just a quick intro this week again to say that we're still on a little bit of a break with the podcast while I'm wrapping up a couple of other features. So we're going to play part 2 of the 2-part series with JP Ballard of SwissSide. We had part 1 last week. Kind of makes sense to roll out part 2 as well, and definitely suits me while I'm trying to get a few recordings in the bank. Got a couple of exciting ones coming up, and also, as I said last week, working on a couple of bigger features that are really eating up my time at the moment. So in the meantime, enjoy part 2 of the episode that we recorded last year with JP Ballard. I'll kick us off in terms of time trialing with the old adage that lower and narrower is faster. Is that like an Aero myth, or is that, is it a good starting point just to get as low as you can and you're fairly safe bet at that?
Yeah, so I would say true in terms of going lower. We'll split narrow out of it. So yeah, typically aerodynamic drag is dependent on your frontal area. In the first case, there are obviously other things that are important. So going lower typically reduces your frontal area. Going narrower is then questionable because it's about the flow around the body. So if by going narrower, you're reducing your shoulder width and reducing your frontal area, that can be beneficial, but narrower isn't always better. So that's a maybe. But of course, the big caveat here is you can't be impacting your power. So, a lot of what we do in the wind tunnel is we get the riders to try lower and lower positions, and we get them to have either ideally tried those positions beforehand to know where their threshold is, where they start losing power. So it's, in the end, it's just a net game. So if you say, okay, I've got a new position, it's lower, it's 10 watts faster, and okay, I do have a power penalty, but the power penalty is only 5 watts, it's a net gain, so you can choose to go with it or not. But in general, lower is faster.
Speaking of lower and narrower, I published an article yesterday, and I'd sort of theorized, for lack of a better term, that narrower head tubes could be a visual acid test for the overall aero performance of modern frames. Part of what I was thinking was, with the internal routing that we've seen in the past decade, head tubes have sort of got wider to accommodate those internal hoses and cables, and as such, perhaps the aero gain from hiding the cables actually was lost with the wider head tube. And what we're seeing a lot with modern frames now, and one of the bikes that you worked on, the Canyon Aero you mentioned earlier, is one that I had noticed does have a particularly narrow head tube, that brands seem to be now turning to not just ticking the box of hiding their hoses and their cables, but also reducing the width of the head tube as much as possible. Is that a good acid test? Is that true or false?
I would say the head tube design is definitely an acid test of whether a bike's been well developed, so true. Whether it has to be narrow, as soon as you've got a nice aero profile, yes, it has lower drag if it has a smaller frontal area. But with aero profiles, it's very much about what we call the pressure recovery and the wake that profile has. So that's if you've got a slightly wider profile, but it comes together nicely at the back and the flow remains attached on that profile, actually it can be very low drag. So in terms of going absolutely narrower for everything, it's actually okay if you have to go a little bit wider. And head tube stiffness is actually also a really important topic, and that's driven very much by the bearing sizes, and as well the spacing of the bearings. So there are some other constraints that force you to have slightly larger head tube profiles. But you see now a lot of these sort of stepped shapes, so where the bearings are, the headset bearings are, you've got kind of a much wider profile, and then you step in. A lot of bike manufacturers are now trying to route the cables through the center of the steerer tube now as well to sort of gain back that width. But yeah, yes, in terms of the intricacy and how much effort's been put into the design of a head tube, I think is a litmus test into if it's a well-developed aero bike.
Are there any other tests that you could visually look at and quickly basically assess?
Yeah, down tubes is a clear winner. Okay. So you've still got some bike brands doing weird shaped down tubes which have got sharp edges in the wrong places. A down tube is pretty simple. You want an aero-shaped profile, so you need a nice aerodynamically shaped leading edge on it, and ideally it needs to sort of return as much as possible. On down tubes, you'll see this cam tail, so a wide trailing edge. But yeah, as soon as you see a bike that has a roundish tube or a hexagonal tube, or sharp lines in the widest points or something, then you can be pretty sure that they don't understand the topic of aerodynamics. And the down tube's the biggest tube on the bike. It's one of the most important ones from an aerodynamics perspective. That's also an important one. The other one's the cockpit. So the handlebar, what they've done with the handlebar, handlebar is extremely important. It's the first thing that sees the wind. It's seeing pretty much full energy airflow. So what they're doing with the handlebar, how clean it is, that's also a really important topic.
How clean it is. Is there anything else you're looking for in the handlebar that's obvious? Is it like thin tops or flare drops, or is there anything specifically you're looking for in the handlebar?
Yeah, more the sort of the top bar part.
And integration with the stem, I guess, or
exactly, integration with the stem, the shape of the profile. Now, of course, there are other ergonomic questions.
Yes.
For example, I know working with Canyon that they had very strong opinions on the shape of the top part of the handlebar and what's ergonomic. Funnily enough, working with other brands, they have completely different opinion. Okay. Have really long profiles, quite sharp trailing edges. I personally quite like that because I sort of lean with my hands on the top bar when I'm climbing. But yeah, looking at a nicely integrated sort of one piece, you'd see all the top level bikes nowadays have a stem and handlebar integrated. Looking at the integration, looking at the shape of the top tube, of the horizontal part of the handlebar, all very important. Some brands also have on the drops, sort of the more vertical part of the drop going into an aero profile. You're seeing this more and more. Makes installation of the clamps for the brakes more difficult, but take a look at handlebars as a good idea if they've done a good job.
We're going to have some take-home aero hacks a bit later. In terms of these aero tops of the handlebars, is that aero benefit lost if you wrap bar tape, the traditional point of wrapping bar tape right up, almost up to the stem? Do you have to leave the tops bare, or can you still get the aero gain from having bar tape?
Putting bar, so I actually did, I'm trying to remember, I think it was with Bike Radar at the time with Ben Delaney. We did a test in the wind tunnel. He came and said, right, I want to try that out. And I think it was a watt at 45 kilometers an hour to put bar tape on those top bars. So it is a penalty. But of course, depends if your goal is to go out cycling and enjoy cycling, and that's important from a safety or a comfort perspective, then go ahead. But if you want to milk all of those last watts, you certainly want to minimize how much tape you have.
What's the difference between a round top and an aero optimized top? Would it be more than a watt? Or
10 watts.
10, okay.
I mean, a round bar.
So you're still better with bar tape on a aero optimized top?
So on an aero optimized top, you would still be better with bar tape. Absolutely. Yeah. If you want to maximize the aero of that aero profiled handlebar, you want to minimize the tape and only have tape where you actually use it.
Okay. Moving on to, I think, the most popular of aero myths. Aero doesn't matter if I'm going uphill.
Oh, classic. Aero matters everywhere. There's a threshold where aero versus weight trickles over. For the pros, it's around about 7.5% average gradient. And
is there like a power figure attached to that, or a power to weight figure?
Yeah, there is. So like that's based on around about 380 watts climbing power. So it's actually a little bit below pro, but that's sort of the threshold where weight you would start to look at lighter weight over the top of aero. Of course, amateurs like myself travel at much slower speeds, so that gradient drops to around about 4.5%. But the important thing to say is that's the average gradient. So, I think you've done some Everesting, but when was the last time you've done an average ride that has on average 4.5%? That's 4,500 height meters per 100 kilometers. And the answer is for most people, pretty much never. So the point is when you go back down the other side of the mountain, the aero starts winning back time for you. When you go along the flats at the bottom, the aero's winning time for you. Yes, you're slower up the hill, but overall, the aero is always faster. So up until an average gradient for an amateur, 4.5%, for a pro, around 7.5%. What that basically means is it's only important if you have an uphill time trial or like an uphill finish, where the uphill is the strategically important part. But otherwise, aero beats weight pretty much all of the time, which is why I say it's about 95% aero driven nowadays. And we'll see it more and more in the World Tour, and of course in the other continental and other racing. I think we're going to see more and more just aero bikes being used pretty much all the time, except for very odd occasions.
Well, as I said to someone at the time, 50% of the distance of an Everesting is downhill at 80, 90 kilometers per hour. The other one is, or the other classic, I guess, is aero doesn't matter if I'm slow.
Oh, this is one of my favorites. So the slower you are, the more important aero is. Get your head around that. Now,
I mean, I know this and I still can't get my head around it. So
there's two reasons for this. One, if you're slower, you're on the course for longer.
Mm-hmm.
So it takes you longer to do, which means the percentage gain that aero brings you equates to more time. So there's more time saving if you're slower that you can gain with an aerodynamically optimized setup. The second part of it is this sailing effect, what we've talked about. Now, the slower you are, the bigger the effective onset airflow angle that you have. So for a pro, because they're going faster straight ahead through the wind, for a given crosswind strength, they'll see a smaller effective onset flow angle. The slower you go, the bigger the effective angle. So that means the more crosswind you'll feel. So that means your sails on your bike, so your wheels, your bike frame, will work better. So the more angle they see up to a certain point, they'll work better and reduce the drag of your system more. So the slower you go, the more sailing effect you have, the more you benefit from the sailing effect from the drag reduction that those type of products bring. So actually, as an amateur, you benefit more from the aerodynamics of aerodynamically optimized equipment than a pro does.
The analogy I've used for the being longer on the course and aero helping you for longer was cake and a fork. And that if you had 5 minutes to eat as much cake as you possibly could, a fork would be useful. And the fork is the aero in this analogy. But if you had 5 hours to eat cake, the fork is still going to help you. It's probably going to help you consume a lot more cake because you're forking the cake into yourself non-stop for 5 hours. So I don't know if that works or not, but that's the one I've used.
Yep.
Going back to time trials and positions, flat back is always fastest.
We've done literally hundreds and hundreds of athletes in the wind tunnel, and typically I would say, yeah, flat back is pretty good.
Okay.
So one of what it does is it makes you less sensitive, and it makes the suit less likely to the flow from separating off the suit. So if you've got a really rounded back, and when we talk about flat back, we're talking about you're low enough that your back can be horizontal, not that it's flat at a 45-degree angle. And it basically helps the airflow stay attached on your back for longer, which just helps reduce your drag.
Related to that, short tail time trial helmets are faster.
Ooh, very rider dependent.
Okay.
So there's no one, this is maybe another myth to bust, there is no one fastest time trial helmet. It's so dependent on your head position relative to your body, what you do with your head during a time trial. And so we have athletes that have a very low head position, they look forwards, and that's how they ride, and they're very stable with their head. For them, a long tail helmet is better, yes. But for a rider we have other riders that ride more looking down, and if we do a quick jump into triathlon where people are doing much longer distances, they tend to let the head hang.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you ride like that, and some time trialists do that as well, if you ride like that, then a long tail helmet's just going to be sticking up in the wind, then a short tail helmet is better for you. Similarly, if you move your head around, you're looking around a lot, you're not very stable with your head position, then a short tail helmet will typically be better. So, for example, when we developed the Rudy Project wing helmet, that was a helmet that was designed for a low head or for people that would move their head around a lot, and was designed to bring the maximum performance there. When we developed the current spec TT helmet of Ekoi, which is this Koina helmet, which you see a lot of people riding, it was developed around two athletes that had a very stable forward-looking head position. You have to pick a helmet that works for you and your head position is the answer.
Presumably that means the helmet manufacturers have to pick a rider type that they're going to develop towards.
Absolutely. And the most clever manufacturers, and I've got, we have no relationship with them, but I have a lot of respect for Met helmets because there's no one helmet that's the best, but the Met drone and this Met coated Tronca helmet that always ends up in the front of the mix with whatever athletes we're testing. And of course, they have these two lengths. So the Met drone is quite a long tail, wide body helmet. The coated Troncas are much shorter, cut off helmet. And so basically, they're providing a product that fits both types. And I think helmet manufacturers need to provide two types of helmets.
Would it be possible to have one rider adopt a range of positions and sort of assess how a helmet works for a specific? Because we see some time trialists have an arch back, some have a flat back, some have sloping back, some have wide shoulders, narrow shoulders. Could you get one rider to adopt a load of different positions, try every helmet, and then say this helmet works for this type of position and this helmet works for this type of position? Or is it actually, regardless of the position, it's rider dependent?
It's really rider dependent. And it's also dependent on the suit, the interaction with the suit as well. So it's really hard for pro cycling teams, World Tour teams, because they've got to pick one helmet for the whole team. Forcibly, the helmet's going to work really well for some, and it's not going to work well for others. So, for example, when we developed the TT helmet for Van Rysel, which will be used by the Décathlonage des Airs, La Mondiale team, we really developed a helmet that was shorter tail so that it had a chance of working for the best for all of the riders. If we would develop a long tail helmet, for some it would have been better, for others it would have been a lot worse. So it was very much to design a helmet that can work the best for most.
Sticking with TT helmets then, taping up the vents is faster.
Fact, yes.
Okay.
But we mentioned earlier how important cooling is.
Mm-hmm.
And cooling of the head is not just important for cooling, but it's also important for the body's perceived temperature. So very dangerous. And if we take it to a further step again, jumping to the idea of triathlon and these guys that do the Ironman in Kona, Hawaii, riding down the Queen K Highway is brutal in the lava fields. You have to have cooling. And if you don't have good cooling on the head, you don't finish the race. Yes, it's faster to tape up your helmet slots. Normally it's 1 to 2 watts at 45 kilometers an hour. So when we develop helmets, we develop specifically with cooling in mind. We have cooling targets. We develop to those cooling targets, and we test with them.
I believe there's a couple of studies have been done on the benefit of thermoregulation versus the aerodynamic benefit of a helmet, but
could be. I mean, we basically we just know that you have to have cooling,
Yeah.
so we want to make cooling as efficient as possible. Yeah, a little insight, when we're designing a helmet, we're not just designing the external aerodynamics, we're designing the internal channeling and the internal aerodynamics, and particularly with the CFD development, we're simulating both external and internal flow together. And we also not just doing it in terms of mass flow, so the amount of air that goes through the helmet, but looking at the heat exchange. So we have a sort of a combined thermal and CFD model. And the same goes when we test in the wind tunnel. We have a heated head where we can also do thermal measurements as well. So we can really literally measure how many watts of cooling does a helmet bring.
a heated head, is that just a hot-headed individual?
It's just a hot-headed individual.
Lastly, on helmets then, are road aero helmets as rider specific, or is there a bit more flexibility with it?
No, a lot more flexibility. We see very little dependence with road helmets.
Okay.
So
is that because of the upright position, or
the more upright position? So less interaction with the body, less importance to the body position. Rule of thumb: longer tail helmets. So one of the real benchmark helmets, year after year, seems to be the specialized Evade series of helmets. I think they're up to the Evade 3 now. It's pretty much always one of the benchmark helmets, both in terms of aero performance and drag. So kudos to Specialized with what they've done there on the helmets.
Specifically on that, I did a 15-hour time trial in June, and it started 6 a.m. in the morning. Was cold, foggy, misty, and that, and I had a time trial helmet on, and cooling wasn't an issue. But later in the day, it actually, if I remember correctly, it actually turned out to be the hottest day of the year in Ireland. It was well over 20 degrees Celsius, which we wouldn't be used to. And I switched to the Specialized Evade somewhere mid-ride because it was just, I could sense it was getting too hot. Is a road aero helmet like that, would it be as rider dependent then in the time trial position? And is it a good choice on a really hot day like that? Can you swap in a road aero helmet and not really penalize yourself? Is it a gamble you could take confidently, I'm guessing, is the question?
I mean, if you're doing a 15-hour time trial, absolutely, because your thermal management's super important. So we've done good aero road helmets in TT positions on our TT with athletes, with dummies and whatever. typically, like a good Aero road helmet is sort of in the middle of the mix of TT helmets. So let's say the difference between a good TT helmet and a road helmet, the TT position's around about 10 watts at 45 kilometers an hour. And let's say the specialized evade type of helmet is somewhere in the middle. So that would be the difference to a standard road helmet. Okay, really bad road helmets, not bad, but completely open, traditional style climbing helmets are significantly worse, probably another 5 watts on top of that as well. So up to 15 watts difference in the time trial position. But an evade is probably about a 5 watt penalty at 45 kilometers an hour. So, if we say compared to losing 20% of your power if you overheat, it's a no-brainer to do that sort of a change.
I have a real nice one for you now. Rim brake bikes are more aero than disc brake bikes.
Ooh, that's a good one. So on day one, when we made the switch from rim brake to disc brake, my answer was yes. However, since then, because of the freedoms you get in the development of the bike shapes, particularly of the wheels, the answer now is no. So the modern latest disc brake bikes are definitely much more aero than the earlier specs of rim brake bikes, and the main reason comes from the wheels. So we can have much wider rims, which gives us much more flexibility on the tire integration, shape of the sidewall of the rim, because of course previously we were restricted by the pad width and the maximum caliper opening possibility.
Yes.
And there were brands like SwissSide that were also you could buy kind of pre-worn or pre-machined down pads to get wider rims in, but we're just much wider now with the rims. And despite the fact that does lead to a slightly larger frontal area, the overall aerodynamic benefit, particularly in sailing effect, is massive. So nowadays, modern day current spec disc brake bikes are certainly faster than their rim brake predecessors.
1x is faster than 2x.
True. Round about 2.5 watts at 45 kilometers an hour. The biggest offender is the front derailleur.
Okay.
It's quite nasty. But nowadays, I have to say the latest spec Shimano Di2 front derailleur is a lot slimmer than the previous generation. So I suspect that's reduced. But if you're just doing a time trial and you want to be as slippery as possible, removing the front derailleur, removing a chainring is beneficial.
There's a World Tour Pro I've had this conversation with back and forth quite a bit. The answer I've sort of been leaning towards is that 1x is faster. If you just test it in one tunnel or test it anywhere,
yes, exactly.
with a straight chain line, 1x is faster. If you then go into an outdoor event and you're cross-chaining an excessive amount, first of all, the question is, does that cross-chaining eliminate the aero gain? Is the cross-chaining loss bigger? And secondly, then, if you factor in professional bike riders and the likelihood that they will not shift down to a more optimal gear anyway and move the front derailleur and rear derailleur to keep a straighter line all the time, pro riders tend to stay in the big ring unless it's very steep climbs, and the cross chaining is just part of how pro cycling works, and therefore maybe that loss is there anyway, even if they've got a 2x setup. So again, it swings back towards the 1x setup. So I've got a true and a false. I think I'm playing devil's advocate here.
Yeah, look, I think it's you're right in that sense. If you're getting extreme cross angles, you're going to lose a lot more efficiency in the drivetrain, and there's a bunch of watts in that. So, it's course dependent is the answer. If it's a rolling course and you're riding 3-4 gears 90% of the time, then it will be faster. And there's also a lot of feedback I've had from athletes is the steps between the gears. If it's some of them, it doesn't work for them. If they're more spinners and they don't have a lot of torque in their legs, it's a no-go. So I think it's very much athlete dependent. It's course dependent. If it's a really hilly time trial, I think it's not going to be the case. But it's I think you're right. I
think my final answer was, if it's a stage where you're not going to come out of the big ring, 1x will be faster. If it's a stage where you could use a smaller ring if you've got a 2x system, then and you're willing to change gears to optimize your chain line, then possibly 2x could be faster. Yeah,
and if the cadence drop when you go from one gear to the next isn't too high, then like you say, if you've got a really small, it's a cassette selection as well, so you can always select a cassette that's got a smaller range that gives you just what you want. So It's actually a really important topic. Going back to simulation work, we find that we're getting a lot more questions. We're doing a lot more work on gear setups. What's the best gear setup with the least amount of chain angle and so on, so that they can choose the right chainring sizes and choose the right cassette.
Time drop positions for a second. High hands is always faster.
Oh, high hands is in like
praying mantis position sort of thing.
No, not always. No.
Okay.
Now again, it depends. So rule of thumb from my experience, and again, this is just my experience, is up to 15 degrees angle. 15 degrees, you can start to get a benefit, and up to sort of 20 if you're closing the gap to the face enough. So it's about sort of switching the airflow, because when you angle the arms, you're increasing the frontal area of the arms. Yes, there's a body behind them, but it does have an impact. So there is an effective frontal area increase. And so for some riders, flat arms is faster. In triathlon, we can do what we want. So some of these guys have 45-degree angles, and they run true praying mantis positions where they completely close their nose to their hands, and that switches the whole aerodynamic flow system. And that can be really beneficial. But with the restrictions we have with the UCI regs, it's much of a muchness. Depends on their body position, depends on the head position. So I will say no to high hands is always better because it's very athlete dependent.
Okay, the other one, if I set up a mirror beside my turbo tuner and just replicate Dan Bigham's position, will I be as fast as him?
Oh, look, I think Dan is optimized to the hilt. Dan's great because
that was a question from a guest we've had not a question, but that was a myth buster from a guest we've had in the podcast previously, Mark Gravelin, and he was saying like you can't just replicate someone else's position. You have to test your own.
No, look, I think no. Like what I was going to say is if you're Dan's size and you're Dan's shape and you've got Dan's head position and you're riding Dan's suit and you've got his cockpit and you've got his bike, then yeah, you're probably going to be best in his position. But if you're not, you're going to have to do your own research and find it. I mean, I've got to say, after years and years and years in the wind tunnel, it's just so individual. And even with athletes, when I'm like, all right, we're going to make this change. This is a gimme. This is definitely going to be better. And it's 5 watts worse. Even with my experience, I'm just like, okay, I don't know. I know that I don't know.
I want to change subject here a little bit, and I want to touch on sort of bang for buck in terms of aero interventions. And I'd heard recently on Josh Portner's Marginal Gains podcast that I think it was they had said that Vincenzo Nibali's 2014 Tour de France winning setup with his mostly round tube frame, medium profile rims, ventilated helmet, jersey and shorts was something around about 15%. A modern day setup was around about 15% faster or something. Let's not hold them to that figure. I think it was just a round figure that they'd used for the purposes of the podcast. Obviously those guys know what they're talking about. But what I wanted to ask you is that if someone at home had that setup, they had bought themselves all that kit 10 years ago, where is the best bang for buck in terms of if you wanted to upgrade step by step that equipment? And I guess maybe the place to start is that 2014 mostly round tubed frame versus an aero optimized frame of today. How, maybe even better, where is the biggest step that you can take, or the best bang for buck step that you can take if you wanted to make that step?
So first of all, 15%, is it realistic? Yeah, absolutely. If we say that's based on 350 watt, 300 watt power output, what are we talking about? 45 watt straight. Yeah, easy. I'd say a lot more actually. So maybe some basic figures. First of all, what's the biggest bang for your buck? Well, your biggest bang for your buck is you. So you as the rider, you're 70% plus of the aero drag. So best thing you can do is focus on your equipment and on what you're wearing, and having a well-fitted, ideally if you can find something aerodynamically optimized, but again, it's very individual. But let's say a good aero one-piece suit, if you want to go that far, but at least a good one, good aero jersey, a good aero helmet. Those things don't cost huge amounts of money and are going to bring you some pretty big gains.
Might you even say then an aero testing session to focus on the rider themselves? Because you could buy a lot of kit and not really know if that's faster.
Absolutely right. Yeah, and look, absolutely right. I mean, I've actually, you've raised a really good point. I say the best thing you can do is go to and do some yoga classes.
Okay.
Because we talked about earlier getting in a low position, for example, being able to ride on the drops for longer, being able to ride with on the top bar with flat arms, 90 degree, takes a lot of core strength. So doing some Pilates, doing some yoga, getting flexibility, getting mobility, all things you can do in your own home with YouTube tutorials at no cost. That's actually the best way you can make yourself faster from an aerodynamics perspective on a bike. Then, of course, looking at the equipment, focusing on what you're wearing. So again, sort of suits and stuff. And like you say, doing it to be able to really quantify if you can borrow a bunch of suits, tricots, helmets from your circle of friends, doing an aero test to figure out what's actually faster for you as an individual with your setup and your position, that's certainly worth a lot.
Would it be possible to put an average percentage or watts or drag saving from a 2014 helmet to a modern day helmet, or a 2014 jersey and shorts to a modern one-piece suit?
I mean, helmets, I think, have certainly probably come forward by 10 watts at 45 kilometers an hour. Now, to sort of bring that to 35 kilometers an hour as maybe a more reasonable speed for road cycling at a performance level, you can halve it. So it's about 5 watts.
Okay.
So I'd say that's where we're at now with the helmets. Suits, again, it's really difficult because it's so individual, and it's potentially suits in the past could have been just as good because it's just about what works for you.
Okay.
But I think, in general, they can easily be at 35 kilometers an hour, easily again another 5 watts, possibly more there. What I can give you is some real figures on bike frame. So previously to this podcast, I dug through a little bit of my development history to get some information. So let's say a totally unoptimized bike frame is going to have, so the frame and wheels around about 100 watts of drag at 45 kilometers an hour. I'll stick with 45 kilometers an hour because it's our wind tunnel benchmarking speed. Then let's say not optimized road frame, but at least they were thinking about aerodynamics when doing it. So maybe they didn't have stupidly round tubes and whatever, is maybe 15 watts better. So at about 85 watts. A typical good performance aero road bike, and like we benchmark everything that's on the market, you're below 70. So let's say about 68 watts. So, we're already, over 30 watts faster than an unoptimized bike.
Mm-hmm.
And last year, I think it was, the UCI rules changed that allowed us a lot more flexibility in tube sizes, compensation triangles. Basically, we can make a TT bike, a road frame like a TT frame for most of the profiles. And the very first bike that we developed to those regulations was the Simplon Pride 2. And that was another 10 watts better again, so mid 50 watts. So we're approaching...
So that's 50 watts versus...
100.
For a round tube frame, or sort of aero considered?
Sort of aero considered, let's say it's about 85 watts.
Okay, yes.
And sort of this, sort of like, let's call it mid 50s, so a good 30 watt advantage at 45 kph, so at 35, good 15 watts.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where you are in terms of figures with those bikes. So and that's all with the same set of rims. If you take a box section basic set of rims, and you can add 15 watts across the board to all of that. So so that's kind of where you're at. And I'd say in terms of where we were with wheels, we're certainly a good 5 to 7 watts better than we were previously, and sailing effect massively more potent. So at certain angles, we can be in double figure, 10 watt plus aero savings compared to older wheels. So I'm talking about aero wheels compared to aero wheels similar depths.
Yeah, it was. What did you say the difference was to low profile or box section rims?
About 15. So we sort of see between a decent, say, 50, 60 millimeter, a good performing aero rim to a box section rim, there'd be a good 15 watt difference between those.
We'll not do it here now, but if I wanted to work out actually bang for buck, could I take the savings you've just mentioned there and divide them by the cost of the...
Absolutely. So when you look at that, I always say, even if we're a wheel manufacturer, I wouldn't tell people the first thing to do is buy wheels, because they still cost a good set of wheels is 1,500 to 2,500 euros, whereas you can buy a good suit or a good aero top for 200. You can buy
you mentioned helmets. 5 watts.
Yeah, so helmet suits are absolutely your best bang for buck. Or we go back further, doing your yoga, doing your Pilates is even more.
I can beat you again with a number you gave us earlier, and removing some of the bar tip from your Aero handlebar tops will save you a watt and cost you nothing.
Absolutely.
So there's the best bang for buck.
Yep. Oh, and even bottles, round bottle on a down tube, they're terrible things.
Okay.
So if you want to, again, for practical purposes, you run around with round bottles. But if it's all about minimizing aero, there are UCI legal, the elite aero bottles.
Yeah, gripper and re-gripper bottles and bottle cages that come on the new Cannondale Super 6 Evo have like a squared off side to them, but a normal round lid.
Yep.
And a cage that has a squared off side also, but will accept a round bottle if you get stuck with a round bottle, but also works with these aero bottles. I really like that. I've used the elite ones previously, and they're
difficult.
They're not as practical.
Yeah.
Oh, that's where this one's getting cut off. Sorry, everybody. If you are not a member, this is where the show ends. If you want to hear the rest, head to escapecollective.com/join and get signed up.
Can I say it's not just to be annoying that we cut you off halfway if you're not a member. It's not some cult that we're running here where it's on members exclusive only. It's because by becoming a member, you're actually contributing to, well, it's like a virtuous circle, isn't it? By becoming a member, you fund Escape Collective. By funding Escape Collective, I can do this job. By doing this job, I can produce more podcasts like this, which in turn, you can listen to as a member. So the circle continues.
We are 100% member funded. We work for our members, and that's why we make all this podcast content for you and website content and everything else.
We're just lab mice on a real thing, running around in circles, making virtuous circles with our members and podcasts every day of the week.
Just sign up. Just, head over there, escapecollective.com/join. If you like this podcast, it's really very cheap, right? Like it's cheap. So head over there, escapecollective.com/join, sign up, get the rest of the pod. You're missing out on all kinds of free watts floating around out there that you don't know about. See you next time.